got through the whole thing without talking about Doc Manhattan's blue hanging brain. Very proud.
Who Watches the Ethicists? Welcome, friends. Today we are talking about Who Watches the Watchmen, the movie, and somewhat the comic book, and the ethical questions therein. My name is Matthew, and this is Superhero Ethics. And of course, I'm joined as always by my co-host, Jacob. Jacob, how you doing tonight?
I am very excited to talk about this really friendly, PG-rated animated series that appeared on Saturday mornings. It's just a bunch of goofy heroes.
Stop. Yeah, we will put that in the show notes for those who want to torture themselves of a cartoon version of it's like an ad for a Saturday morning cartoon version of the Watchmen, in which Rorschach is great with animals and Dr. Manhattan has a bedtime. But today we're perhaps going to focus on a little bit more mundane version of the Watchmen story. We're focusing today on the movie and a little bit on the comic book. My wanting us to do Jacob and I have been talking about this project for a long time, in part because it's completely in our wheelhouse. The entire book movie idea is to ask ethical questions about the very concept of superheroes and justice and vigilantism and revenge and how they all play into each other. And we've sort of always had it on the back burner, and then recently, because another podcast in this podcast network that we're a part of is specifically on the TV show The Watchmen, that got me to watch the TV show, and it made me realize just how much there is to dig into here. So probably in another episode sometime soon, friend of the podcast, Matt Carroll, will be joining me for a discussion of the TV show, but today we're focusing on the movie and the comic book. So with that, let's kind of jump into the general topic. Jacob, just kind of starting out, what are your general thoughts on this movie and this comic book? What's your kind of general thoughts on this story?
So the first time I was exposed to this story was as the graphic novel when I was in my, I want to say, early 20s. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever because at the time I hadn't seen very many superhero stories where the superheroes were quite so broken and not particularly heroic and did things that I didn't agree with. And so I was instantly hooked. It shouldn't shock anybody that you give me a superhero story where people are doing ethically challenging things all the time and suddenly I'm more interested. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of why we're doing this, right? This is we find things to hem and haw about in stuff that we're ostensibly supposed to be behind the heroes 100%. And here, these are presented for us within the movie, within the media, as we're intended to see them as challenging, right? We're intended to question the actions of the comedian or of Night Owl or of Rorschach, because no individual person is necessarily acting in a Superman-esque way, right?
Right. There's no Captain Americas here. I mean, to my mind, the Punisher would be kind of on the good side of things when it comes to the Watchmen.
The Punisher is like an ethical comedian, which is a wild statement.
Well, and I think for me, I really do love this movie, and every time I watch it, it troubles me, and that's part of why I love it. And I think because of it, and we're going to talk more about this in general, I don't see anyone in this movie who I can call remotely heroic. Some of them take heroic actions in particular situations, but kind of the main conflict of the movie is this plot by one of them, Ozymandias, who I think we could qualify him in the supervillains who might have had a point, and we'll debate whether his actions were right. But certainly our heroes find out what he did, it's too late to stop him, and then they don't really do much about it, and the one who tries to gets destroyed. Mm-hmm. So it's I'm searching my head now, and I think there's one or two times where a fight gets broken up or an attack gets stopped. But do we actually see any of these characters on screen take a truly heroic act?
Oh boy!
Not to kind of start us off easy, but
it's been a long time since I've seen the movie or read the graphic novel. My gut instinct is no, because I can't there's not a thing that stands out to me and I go, oh yeah, this one time. Like generally speaking, we end up seeing them doing, yeah, not really. Even when they're, ostensibly going after bad guys, or in some cases being, you know, an arm of the state or the military, it's not in a good light.
Right.
I guess you could make the argument that some of the stuff Doc Manhattan does for the advancement of technology and of things like medicine, that's generally good.
Right.
The problem is the character of Doc Manhattan himself has become separated from humanity, right? So it's like,
Right.
yeah,
And even that's being an awesome scientist and
Right.
like researcher, but it's not like a superhero in the kind of way we talk about,
right. And I mean, the narrative would have us believe that what Ozymandias does is ostensibly heroic because what it does is it advances a cause that every hero wants, which is world peace, right?
Right.
But yeah, that's a very ends means discussion, right?
Yeah. And we'll get into that. I will use this as a time to say, like, kind of one of my general thoughts about the movie itself. And I say this, for the most part, I'm going to avoid spoilers about the TV show, but I'll say one thing I really liked about the TV show is it takes the questions of the Watchmen and puts it in the modern day and kind of translates it into modern day issues. And I'm a big fan of things that do that. Like, one of my favorite examples is V for Vendetta. Mm-hmm. V for Vendetta was very significantly written during the Thatcher administration about the problems that the British government and society was dealing with under Thatcher. By the time they make the movies, it's 15 years later, and they make a conscious effort to sort of update the villains and update the situation. So much of this movie is predicated on the idea of the book and the movie is the Cold War is this incredibly intractable conflict that will almost assuredly lead to world destruction. And so that raises the question of, are Ozymandias' actions justifiable? But by the time the movie was made, the Cold War was over.
I mean, by the time the graphic novel was made, the Cold War was over. It's a period piece.
I thought it was written in the 80s themselves, or at least in the early 90s. Okay, well, in some ways that makes it even worse, but then I can't blame the movie necessarily. But I feel like to ask us, if you were to make it today and say, like, will the conflict with, name whatever boogeyman you want to name of our modern day be ever solved? Like, sure. But when the whole thing is set up as what crazy ethical extremes can we go to prevent the Holocaust of the Cold War, with the idea that, like, the Cold War Holocaust would be inevitable, when we've all lived through the Cold War and know that it's not,
right.
I guess to me that...
I have a correction, sorry. You are correct. It first appeared in 1985. Cold War historians seem to somewhat consensus say that it ended in 91.
Right.
Although, like, it's not a real whatever. Like,
I mean, 85 though was definitely the height of Reagan putting incredible pressure on the Soviets and people thinking World War III was a distinct possibility.
Right.
Anyway, so it's not really an ethical question, but I think it speaks somewhat to the questions of being true to your source material versus updating your source material for the times.
I mean,
because I always felt like on some level I never felt the existential dread of the millennium or of the midnight clock because I knew how the story ends in our own world.
Right. I think it is actually an ethical question. Because if you're gonna take a story, if you're gonna take an existing story and you're gonna present it to a modern audience, I feel like, and they did this somewhat because they changed They changed a portion of Ozymandias' plan so that it would play better to a larger audience. If you're already going to change the narrative, I think that it makes more sense to make the conflict, make something that the people who are watching it now can connect to, so that it has the same impact of the original media.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think it's sort of, and I'm not saying this as like a criticism of the people who made the movie, but like, it's it doesn't have the same effect if you're not taking the Cold War as something, and World War III as a realistic possibility.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the same bite, and so the narrative doesn't make as much sense. And all of these, like, honestly, a lot of the characters make less sense if you don't understand what it's trying to evoke.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'm curious about this. Because actually, I am critical of the movie makers because I think it makes a less good a movie that's not as good as it could have been. And I will say I rewatched the movie recently in preparation for this, and I was able to kind of more suspend my disbelief and in that world say, if we live in a world that's on the brink of World War III, does that make Ozymandias's decisions more ethically okay, or at least understandable? Mm-hmm. Because I think the first time I watched it, that was my thought was Ozymandias is acting as though he has to act or else there's no way to preserve the peace. And my reaction is, but we didn't need you, dude. Like, calm down. And it does make me think, and I'd be curious to people who, for this applies to, we now have a generation of people who have grown up after the Cold War ended, who are watching this movie. And I would be curious for someone of that perspective, like, if you did not live through the Cold War in the slightest, I imagine that maybe it is more engaging because you didn't live through the Cold War, but therefore you also didn't live through it ending, so the idea of this existential, I don't know, maybe the existential dread is even less for you, or maybe it makes more sense. But if you're a younger generation like that, I'd love for you to write in and talk to us about it.
Yeah, it's something that I can't imagine it has the same impact if you didn't experience it, but I don't know for sure because I was young during the latter portion of it, but I did exist in the world.
Right.
And I was aware of the concerns and the fear at a younger age, right? And so when I watched when I read and then later watched as an adult, I got some of that. I got some of the connection. And I do think that it makes a difference, and it makes actions that seem completely unconscionable and unreasonable seem plausible, if not something that we agree with.
Right. What do you have any other general thoughts on the movie before we dive into some specific questions? I have one more, but I'll give you a chance first.
I know that a lot of people, when the movie came out, there were some criticisms levied against it that were broadly like, this is actually just directly the way the source material did it too. About the visuals, about how none of the characters were, what's the way I want to put it? You couldn't connect with any of the characters, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like personally for me that is on purpose, and I feel like if you can connect with one of the characters and you can empathize with them, you're probably not in the best place in your life, and I'm sorry for that, but I really hope that nobody is for very long feeling like one of the Watchmen in their life, because these are individuals who what they've experienced and what they've gone through has put them into this sort of fugue state where they're taking the best worst action rather than taking the best actions.
Right. Well, I would push back on that a little because I do think a lot of these characters are. I mean, I think none of them, as I think, are heroes. I think all of them are deeply problematic people. Some more than others, obviously. Like the comedian, I think, being pretty low on the list, and Ozymandias being. Well, there's a whole other interesting question of like, the comedian is just flat out an asshole, whereas Ozymandias is trying to do good, but does in his own way far more damage than the comedian. So that's a whole other ethical question of which one of those is worse. But certainly there's not many that I see as very good. But I do feel like the problems that they're wrestling with is they are problems that many of us can relate to, even if it's not on that kind of scale. I mean, I think everyone has sort of wondered, like, what eggs can I break to try and do some good in the world? Or, kind of the questions that Dr. Manhattan or even like the owl guy goes through of, when do I stand back or when do I step up when my friends are doing shitty things?
The owl guy. His name's Night Owl.
Okay, yeah. I think
I understand. He's not a particularly compelling character sometimes, but he's a person. He has a name.
And when we get there, like, honestly, I think his character is the one I like the least.
Agree.
But that's a whole other story. I will just say, and this is a topic that's been commented on at great length in the past, and I'm not going to go too far into, but I will just say that the treatment of women in this movie, as I understand in the book, is pretty horrid.
Uh-huh.
And that is something
at
that
least.
is distinctly fixed in the TV show, as is the treatment of race. But it's, I think a number of people have commented on that. You and I are probably not the best position to comment on it, although we certainly can raise it, and I'm sure we will comment on it somewhat. But I kind of want to put a mark in that of, like, yes, that is one major problem with this movie, and there's a lot of great people who've written a lot of great stuff on it that I very much recommend people check out.
I feel like when I read the graphic novel, I got the impression that it was like intentionally treating women poorly. And like looking back on it, that's not the way to do it, even if you're going to try to do something like that to make a point.
Yeah.
And it, like, the movie just did not do anything to sort of course correct on that I can recall.
It is very much on my mind now because of another property I just saw, which no spoilers for, but Birds of Prey is something that I think we'll be talking about at some point on this show, possibly with you, possibly with another guest, because it's one of the best superhero movies I've ever seen, or these comic book movies. I absolutely loved it. My partner and I know a number of other women I know have commented that its own way it might be the most feminist that they've seen, and certainly the most girl power that they've seen. And the only thing that's relevant to this specifically is the movie makes a very conscious choice that when women are being treated badly, it lets you know that that's happening, but it doesn't, like, make the trauma entertaining.
Right.
And that's, I think, something distinctly, and again, it's not that Watchmen is much worse than most other movies of the time, but when there's an act of sexual violence happening, that it happens in a very graphic way, in a way that's shot to be, almost in that kind of, like, enticing of, like, erotic violence kind of nonsense.
It's exploitative, and it's eroticized, I think is an accurate statement. It's gross.
Especially given the utter lack of any erotic energy in the actual coupling that happens between Owlman and Silk Spectre, but that's, my own thing.
It felt realistic, at least.
Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah is not an erotic sexual love song. I mean, okay, maybe some people can tell me it's wrong, but, like, it felt like such the wrong song for a sex scene. Anyway, my editorial comments aside, let's get back to ethics questions. As I'm sure 8 million people will tell me that that's their favorite song, erotically.
Erotically?
I'm just saying, like, this is the internet, If
sure
Leonard Cohen's
Hallelujah
is the song that does it for you, God bless you, I still think it's weird in a movie.
Yeah, I'm not going to yuck anybody's yum, I guess. So.
Yeah.
Or
their
not.
kink is not my kink, and their kink is weird. Anyway.
Wait, that doesn't sound like you.
Getting back to the actual topic, now that we've lost any hope of parents letting their kids listen to this.
Oh yeah, that's definitely happening.
Let's start with what I think is kind of the there's probably 3 or 4 major ethical questions that this show raises, that this movie raises in the book. But one of them is just the very question of masked vigilantes themselves. It's the whole premise of it is, on one level, that who watches the Watchmen? That what happens when the society comes to believe that these people actually aren't helpful, and that masked vigilantes are made illegal. What's your take on this movie's perspective on that, and how it frames that question in general?
I mean, what's funny is that I read the graphic novel again when I did, and then I watched this movie put out by Disney Pixar called The Incredibles. And then I saw the Watchmen movie, and I went like, well, wait a minute. This is the same story. It's just that the way it's painted is different, right?
Yeah.
It's the same, like, I think I really appreciated the first time I was exposed to this idea that maybe the public wouldn't be super hot on a bunch of people wearing masks and capes and going around enacting what they felt was justice. That, hey, maybe they wouldn't be okay with that, and there'd be, like, laws, and you'd either have to enlist and be a servant of the government, or you're not allowed to do that, right?
Right.
And that citizens generally would be against it. Honestly, if I lived in this world and these were the heroes I was presented with, I would be against it too.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I mean, it's funny because I feel like the movie wants us to feel like some great injustice has been done to, Owlman and his friends. But I'm just going to keep calling
him Owlman.
Night Owl is okay,
Night Owl.
Fine.
Yeah, he's a song by Little River Band. Sing it with me.
He's also the diner where the people were killed in LA Confidential. But sure.
Oh yeah.
Night Owl. But when I look at them, like, on the one hand, I feel like the movie doesn't actually tell us what was the thing that happened that made people suddenly turn on the masked heroes, except that I would totally turn on the heroes in this movie.
Yeah.
Like,
they went for and all of the historical events they showed us where these people were doing things, and you were like, I don't want this person in charge of determining who gets incarcerated and who doesn't.
Like, the Minutemen are shown as being fairly heroic in some cool ways, and that I get, even though also obviously problematic. But by the time you get to, the Watchmen, we have someone going and basically being a human napalm machine and ending the Vietnam War under incredibly problematic circumstances. Mm-hmm. Another person who, basically, mows down Vietnamese citizens in horrific ways and, kills innocent protesters, both in Vietnam and the States. I guess Night Owl was supposed to do some heroic things flying around, but all we sort of see is him, like, standing by and shrugging as the comedian does terrible things.
He was ostensibly supposed to be, like, the moral compass / Batman type character.
Wow, he's bad at that.
Yeah, basically, the Watchmen narrative is, well, what if Batman were effectively completely impotent and nobody listened to him? And while we're at it, let's make him literally impotent in the narrative because we're not subtle at all.
Right.
That's his character.
Silk Spectre seems to have no real character except to be kind of sad at Dr. Manhattan and then sleep with Dan instead. But yeah
that whole thing is upsetting for many reasons.
But, like, overall, I feel like, and maybe this is, if this is the point of the story, then I think it's a good one, is, I think part of what it's saying is that, like, just because a person puts on a mask does not mean that they stop having all the human foibles that any other person would have. And that, in some ways, it's really dangerous to put on a mask because you could get someone like the comedian who has this, incredibly inflated sense of entitlement and of, personal worth. And that if, someone, doesn't treat him like the hero that he thinks he is, he's just going to shoot him. Yeah. So kind of what's your, I feel like we sort of ask the ethical question of masked vigilantes, good or bad, all the time on this show.
Yep.
What's your take on sort of this story's, twist on that question?
I mean, I think that this particular story, as you said, it tries to paint it as they're good, but now these people have been handcuffed and you should feel sorry for them. And yet I come out of it thinking more than ever, no, this is bad. We would never want this in the real world.
Right.
And because at the end of, I almost said the catchphrase, because those people, they're still people, right? And it's challenging to have one person have that much power without any oversight. And that's another theme that we've talked about ad nauseum on this show, is the idea that any institution of ostensibly masked superheroes, masked vigilantes, without any kind of oversight is no better than what we have now for in terms of making sure that justice is done, or making sure that bad people are stopped from doing their bad things, and that good people are helped.
I mean, Ozymandias is, I think, the perfect example of that, because the decision that he makes is 100% unilateral.
Yep.
It's the, there's so much great stuff in psychology about, like, the way to help people best is to help them, is to help them help themselves.
Yep.
And what Ozymandias is, I mean, he's sort of the ultimate helicopter parent for the entire world.
Yep.
And we'll get more into him in general.
And he goes, he basically comes in and says, I'm so smart. I figured this out. I figured out a way to make everyone do the right thing. And then he enacts the plan. And there's no... It's too late. No one got to question him on it. No one... He didn't bounce the idea off anybody. It's like, no, I'm smart and I'm right and this is what I'm going to do. And in any other story, that would be our supervillain, right?
Yeah.
And technically speaking, in this story, that's our supervillain, except that our heroes are bad at their jobs and don't stop him.
So let's hold that in mind and then use that to start looking into some of the other specific questions that some of the specific characters. And I want to start with the two who, in some ways, I feel like they're all. It's interesting because it kind of gets back to the question we were talking about on a recent episode of who is more evil, the person who's doing evil or the person who kind of stands by and watches and doesn't use their power to stop them. The, Mitch McConnell versus Lisa Murkowski kind of a question.
Right.
Because I think in many ways that Dan and to some extent Dr. Manhattan are the characters in this story that I find the most morally repugnant. Because, to me, the scene that really embodies this, but it's true of Dan kind of throughout the whole movie, throughout the whole story, is it's showing you the night that the ban on superheroes was either first done or was about to be done. There's a big crowd of people who are about to, who are protesting against the heroes and saying that heroes are bad. And one of them throws, it's like a rock or a Molotov cocktail at the big flying owl, Archie, I think it's called, or Arthur, or something like that.
Sure, I think it's Archie.
The bunker mobile.
Yeah.
But it's, and all of a sudden the comedian sort of jumps down and is like, all right, screw this. I'm going to start mowing people down. And Dan kind of just rolls his eyes and goes like, come on, that's why they don't like us. You got to stop. But it's in that sort of like, oh, honey, did you leave the dishes out again?
Yep.
Like, he doesn't in any way, he's in a flying owl. Like, the thing has weapons. The thing has abilities. He doesn't in any way try to stop the comedian. He doesn't in any way rush out to try and help the people he just shot. He just kind of shrugs his shoulders and goes, aw, shucks, buddy, you shouldn't do that. That's not right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
In many ways, both Night Owl and Doc Manhattan they both have the same problem. And it's a problem that exists in other superhero media, but it never gets called out as a problem, where our heroes don't identify themselves as the same as you or I, right? And so for him in that moment, it's almost like he's going, well, these, the people who are protesting down below are... God, like, they're not worth it almost for him. And it's like, God, that's terrible. Like, that's your job, right? That's the thing that you claimed you wanted to do, was stop these kinds of things from happening. And here's one of your allies going and doing one of these things and you do nothing? Doc Manhattan, at least, is literally not human anymore, right?
Right. And, like, Doctor, because, just again, filling in those folks who haven't seen the movie recently or don't remember it, Dr. Manhattan, he faces the same situation, again with a comedian, in a bar in Vietnam, where a pregnant Vietnamese girl is confronting the comedian and saying, hey, listen, this is your child, what are we going to do now? And, she kind of gets in his face when he rejects her, and he winds up shooting her. And at one point, Dr. Manhattan says, you shouldn't have done that, and the comedian says, well, why the hell didn't you stop me?
Yep.
And both of them are kind of awful in that situation because you sort of feel like the comedian has said that with Doc Manhattan there, he doesn't have to think. Someone else is going to stop him. But at least they're like, I find Dr. Manhattan's actions horrific, but at least he, as you said, like, he now has a fundamentally different understanding of space and time than anyone else. He has made a conscious understanding that he doesn't value human life in the way we do.
That doesn't excuse it. That still is repugnant to me, but it makes sense.
It makes sense in a way where, like, to me, Dan, it's just, I feel, Dan just doesn't, I think, just wants people to like him.
Yeah.
He's like,
doesn't know how to make that happen.
Yeah, like it's funny in a Facebook group that I'm in today. A discussion came up because a guy was harassing some of the women in the group, and a couple of their friends were just like, "Oh, he shouldn't have done that, but whatever, it's not a big deal." And a lot of others, of us came down pretty hard on them, and I feel like that's exactly who Dan is. Dan's the guy whose friend shames the girl. And Dan goes up to the girl later and says, like, "Oh, that sucks. I'm sorry he did that. You deserve better than that."
Right.
But he never actually says anything to his friend of being like, "Dude, that's shitty. Stop."
Yeah, I almost wonder if Night Owl was intended, at least in the movie, to be sort of a commentary on the, quote, nice guy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because a lot of his behavior matches that model in really upsetting ways.
I mean, if that's true, it's incredibly sort of pernicious because I don't feel like that conversation was happening. And so my sense is that the author and the movie maker see Dan in a much more heroic light, but I just don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Like, me wanting to have faith in humanity says, well, no, they were forward thinking about this, but realistically, I could absolutely see them going, "Oh, poor Dan, look at this situation he's in, look at how he's having to clean up everybody else's messes, but can't do anything on his own."
Right.
Yeah, whatever.
Mostly I feel like Uncle Ben, Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, would be so pissed at both Dan and Doc Manhattan because, talk about having great power and feeling no responsibility whatsoever.
And that scene that you're talking about with the comedian and Doc Manhattan is particularly poignant to me because I remember when I read the graphic novel that I left with the impression that the comedian was doing it to test Doc Manhattan to see if he would stop him, and so the comedian was literally willing to spend a life to see if he could trust Doc Manhattan to do the right thing. It's like, that's terrible.
Yeah, I had a different read of the comedian's character, and maybe this is just because I've seen the movie. I've tried to read the book. Honestly, and maybe it's from me getting old, the type is too small for me to be able to read comfortably.
That is definitely you getting old.
So, and maybe I just have bad printing or something. Because I just find it very hard to read. But I feel like my reading of it was that the comedian isn't making sort of a conscious ethical choice as a test. He's just really pissed that this, woman he used as a sex object would dare, interfere with him. And certainly that story is one. I mean, the number of pregnant Vietnamese girls who died under suspicious circumstances after being romantically involved with GIs was pretty damn high. Mm-hmm. And I took it as just a comedian just not thinking or caring, but then having this ethical moment afterwards of being like, shit, I fucked up. And then as a not wanting to take responsibility, looking at Doc Manhattan and thinking like, why didn't you stop me? And maybe even some level of if Doc Manhattan is here, I don't have to think about it, So I think he's probably aware of Doc Manhattan and hoping Doc Manhattan stops him is certainly a possibility. I don't think it's a conscious test, though.
There's two different reads of the comedian's character, I think, broadly speaking, and I think it's basically impossible to figure out which side he's actually in, because if the comedian's actions are all intentional and with purpose, rather than reactionary, then you get this sort of character that's like the Joker, but if the Joker thought that he was a hero, right? And I do find that character idea more fascinating, so I tend to go that way with it, which again, he's still the worst, but if you sort of fast forwarding, I guess, to the end, when we find out why the comedian died, he was the only one of them willing, well, I guess only one of two of them willing to, in my opinion, do the right thing.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, but there's an interesting idea there that the comedian and Rorschach are both ones who want to stop Ozymandias, even though those two are presented as, I think with good reason, two of the more morally bankrupt characters in this universe. Although
I don't think there is a morally rich character among the
Also true. Also true.
Maybe Ozymandias' cat thing. I don't know.
I mean, well, and this goes back to the other thing, Silk Spectre, sort of. Although it more feels like women don't have any agency in this world, and thus don't get to be...
If she had more of a character, maybe I would know for sure, but...
Right. And it's funny, because we're slamming on this movie hard. I do love this movie in a lot of ways, because I feel like there's something very insightful about how morally broken all these characters are. But it's not... There's not many heroes. Let's going past just the cowardice part. Do you have anything else to say about Mr. Hooters, or can we put? I hate him so much. I'm gonna come up with nicknames for him.
Mr. Hooters. Okay, that's his name now. He's Mr. Hooters. He does everything owl themed because,
except he wouldn't even make good fried chicken. But anyway,
he does secretly get off on it, so that's in the fiction.
Yeah.
God, it's just so pathetic.
I do like the storyline of him connecting with like the heroes who went before him, and the idea of like the multi-generational hero squad. I think is interesting, and I think is. And I wonder if this is. I feel like there's a very subtle story told in the movie, and I wonder if the comic book brings it out more. Which is like the 1940s when the Minutemen got started were at least in perception wise a much simpler ethical time, and the attempted rape by the comedian of Miss Jupiter kind of I think points out that it was not as ethically simple as we think it was, but that certainly it was like in that time it was easier to be a hero because the people believed that everything was nice and morally black and white and right and wrong and. It was much more the time that Rorschach would have been happy. Right. But that by the time the second wave of Minutemen came along, who I realize in the story are never actually referred to as the Watchmen, like in the world. That's just the title of the book. That part of it's supposed to reflect the fact that like from the 60s to the 80s, the world became so much more morally gray and that there wasn't really a room for heroes in that same kind of way. Does that kind of fit your understanding, or does the book have a very different read?
No, that's about right. So, like, the one broad thing I think that could be said about the narrative as a whole is that as the world gets more complicated and more interconnected, our heroes have a harder time figuring out what the right thing is, and then a lot of them fly off the rails about what the right thing is, in different ways, and some of them, who like the comedian who was around back then, ends up just going off the deep end. But it's like, how do I want to put this? It's the story itself sort of presents these characters in an environment that they're not suited to.
Yeah.
And there's a very real, and this is this is part of why I like it, but it's something I struggle with. There's this intentionality to the brokenness of the characters that makes me feel like a lot of it is intended to evoke the feelings that it does, rather than intended to be treated as media that I'm happy to watch, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I'm not supposed to like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true. I think there's definitely a it's a weird one. And I like that point you make about, the characters are out of time, because that's sort of fitting. Is that like, and maybe part of the way to see it, and maybe this is why Dan keeps going back to, the original Mr. Hooters, is that like all of them are still stuck in wanting that moral black and whiteness, and they don't really get that, I mean, and in some ways this is, I'm just not sure to what extent the author is very knowledgeable and subtle or just missed things in his own story. But the Vietnam thing, for example, like part of the conceit seems to be that we would have won the war in Vietnam if we had overwhelming force in the form of Dr. Manhattan. And particularly in the 80s when that was written, that strikes me really in a weird way, because the Vietnam War was only 12 years over by the time of 1985, the last U.S. troops left in 73. And there still were quite a lot of conservatives and former generals arguing that if, the Americans had really let the military fight with the gloves off and use nukes or use other kind of huge power, that we would have won in Vietnam. And
Right.
today I think there's an understanding of, like, you can't bomb people into loving you. And that the Vietnam, I mean, I would wish there was an understanding. We're still trying it in Iran and Afghanistan. But like, it seems to me that, like, we now understand that the depth of hatred for the Americans and the South Vietnamese, what was seen as a puppet regime, the hatred of that was so strong throughout Vietnam that no matter what amount of force we used, like, we might have conquered, but we would have never won that war. The people have still kept wanting to fight back. Something, again, that is addressed in the new show. But yeah, so that the idea of Dr. Manhattan winning the war in that way always struck me as really off. But maybe that is part of the commentary that the movie's trying to make, or that the story's trying to make.
Yeah, that I don't know, because as you pointed out, and as I misremembered, it was made during that sort of late 80s period where a lot of people did believe that narrative, right?
Yep.
It wasn't much as we like to think that the vast majority of people had the right idea, and it was just the politicians who were advocating dumb stuff, and the military was. It's not true,
Yeah.
right? So there were probably many people involved in the creation of works of fiction who were thinking in those terms and wanted to go, well, in this universe we do have this because we have somebody who gets to unilaterally make the decision rather than have to do whatever Congress or the administration will allow.
Right.
And so because of that, the history changed. Not that Doc Manhattan's such a fascinating character because like he's literally Superman.
Yeah.
But
I was going to say, let's now shift to the character of Dr. Manhattan. We talked about him a little bit in terms of the cowardice stuff, but yeah, where does he fall for you ethically? This sort of weird, person is literally no longer human and now has an understanding of time and space that is so fundamentally different than ours that the kind of moral concerns of our world just don't connect with him.
yeah, the problem of Dr. Manhattan is that his capacity and his understanding of how the world works is from a very macrocosmic perspective,
Right.
He sees the whole universe as a system, right, that needs to function a certain way, and this gets worse the farther the character goes, the farther into the character's story you go, as his understanding continues to expand and evolve, and he gets less and less and less human and has fewer connections. And so I want to apply the same rules of and codes of ethics to his actions as I would to anybody else. But I also kind of have to concede that he doesn't understand that anymore. He doesn't
Right.
see things that way. And so, like, interestingly, I feel like from his perspective, the decisions he's making are correct and are ethically sound. But they're completely baffling and repugnant to us, because we're evaluating him as humans would do. And I think they are, like, repugnant. I'm not saying that he's ethically or morally good.
Right.
More that he thinks he is.
And it's interesting to me because, like, on a personal level, the thing that we are presented as, like, the evidence of him being a bad person is the way he treats, I think it's Laura, Silk Spectre, romantically. Yep. And the whole idea that, like, he could be making love to her while also, coexisting and doing 8 other things. And I think in many ways, those scenes are some of my least favorite in the movie because they're presented in a way where I wind up feeling like she's kind of coming off as, like, shrill and needy, and that you kind of walk away, like, I kind of walk away thinking, like, well, the way Dr. Manhattan understands time and humanity. What were you smoking to make you think that he would ever be a good boyfriend? And it's not that I'm saying that, like, so, that shows that women are bad in this situation. I think it's just really sexist writing of the way her character is presented, but it strikes me as really weird, because if that's the thing we're supposed to look at to say Dr. Manhattan's a terrible person, I sort of feel like, well, yeah, of course he is. You know, of course he's not going to be able to relate to people on that kind of an intimate level in a way that anyone's going to feel comfortable with, because look who he is.
I mean, you say that, and yet we have another character in fiction in a different fiction, who were constantly being presented in these situations where he connects with people or wants to connect with people.
Is this the Doctor?
No, this is Superman.
Oh.
Doc Manhattan is, like, there's a parallel to every character in Watchmen.
Right.
Doc Manhattan's parallel is Superman.
I'm not sure if that's true, though, because the Superman still perceives time linearly. And still relate. He doesn't have this, like, all humans are ants in this larger cage. He still perceives individual people as, you know, and we've talked before about that sometimes his flaw is that he does think that saving Lois Lane, who he has a personal emotional connection with, is more important than battling Doomsday or whatever it is. So yeah, I'm not quite sure I buy that. Like, I think you're right about the omnipotence, but I think that there's the omniscience of Doc Manhattan is so fundamentally different.
It's not the same extreme, right? The difference is that we're given. The problem is that the conceit is that Superman can connect with you or I. I think the character of Doc Manhattan challenges that by showing you, well, if someone was capable of XYZ, they must have the mental capacity to understand these things, and therefore they shouldn't be, you know, they should also have this knowledge, or should also, because, like, some of the things that Superman does really defies our concepts of time and space, right?
That's true.
And so, like, I think that part of that is just because of how the narrative is built.
Right.
And Doc Manhattan kind of challenges those ideas of, can somebody exist with that, with the capacity to do those things physically? And Doc Manhattan is more of an extreme, right? Because he could just, like, rearrange matter at will or whatever the fuck. I don't know. Like,
right.
He's clearly just, like, he's there as, like, a god character. Not like God, but like someone whose capacity for action is effectively limitless.
Right.
And, like, how does that interact with our world? As it turns out, it doesn't interact very well with our world at all. And the story was that when they had the connection, like, Doc Manhattan was, there was interest there. And so I could absolutely, I guess I saw that scene slightly differently, because I saw it as she got into this relationship, and they changed, as people do over time, but he changed into something so alien compared to what she had originally connected with.
Right.
And in that particular moment, which is incredibly exploitative, all she was looking for was, like, a connection, like you're supposed to have in a relationship like that, and he was clearly not interested in investing the entirety of his vast attention into one individual. It still sucks. Like, I don't like that her character is basically used to show us that, when they're, like, it's not the only instance, right? There are many, like the example with the comedian and the Vietnamese woman, right?
Right.
Like, there are many examples throughout the narrative showing us that Doc Manhattan just doesn't care about the same things that we do.
Right.
But you're right that this is the moment in the narrative where we're supposed to go, oh crap, this is not a human being with our concerns and our ideas.
Yeah. And I think it's powerful, and I think it actually speaks to kind of a larger theme, which is that all of these heroes, on some level, are interested in saving humanity. Mm-hmm. But they don't really care much about individual humans. You know, and I think that it goes for different ones. In some ways, really troublingly, Rorschach might be the one who cares most about individual humans. And we'll get to him in a minute. But, like, certainly Ozymandias and Doc Manhattan, and I think to some extent also Silk Spectre and Mr. Hooters, like, all of them, you know, they see like we want to make the world better for people, but when individual persons are in danger, like they're not that upset about it. You know, if I remember, there's like one scene where Hooters and Spectre kind of go out basically like looking for people to beat up because they're both emotionally frustrated about what's happening in their lives. And they prevent a crime happening, and I think it's like a good thing they do, but again, it just strikes me as very like disproportionate to what people are doing.
I recall that maybe this is a graphic novel movie difference that I didn't realize. I recall them saving people from a burning building.
You may be right. I thought...
I recall that, and that is like technically actually a heroic thing.
Right.
Accepting that their motives are because they, Mr. Hooter's motive is that he gets off on it.
Right.
And he needs it to finish. Definitely don't publish this for children.
Yeah, well, okay, so that goes into some more detail than the movie, which is surprising because the movie doesn't seem to really pull its punches. But yeah, I think
that's a real thing.
I think she gets attacked and he rescues her, and that's kind of how they reconnect, and then they go save the burning building. But yeah, it's not well done.
No. So anyway, it's like the characters have this idea in their head about what it is to be a hero and what heroes are supposed to do, but they're like reading from a like generalized guide, and it's like, yep, I care about this, and missing the point.
Yeah.
Right? They're looking at people, they're looking at humanity, and this is what we need to save, and how do we get there, and missing that humanity is made of humans.
And it's interesting to me because we're explicitly told that Silk Spectre is the literal daughter of Miss Jupiter, and so she grows up in a world where like those ideas are passed down to her. At least in the movie, we don't learn anything about why Hooters becomes Hooters or the comedian becomes who he is. We get Rorschach's story, certainly, and we're going to talk about him in a moment. But it's interesting to think about like how does that idea get passed down? I think we're going to save Ozzy actually for the last one to talk about. So let's talk about Rorschach for a bit. First of all, just this is my own sort of story-making complaint, and I'm wondering if the book makes it clearer. Watchmen seems to exist in a weird gray area between, like, they never explicitly say that any of these characters have superpowers other than obviously Dr. Manhattan, and yet they do a number of things that seem superpowered. Certainly, Hooters and Spectre win fights that they seem to have no business winning, and they're it doesn't seem like they're just, you know, well-trained fighters, but they're well above that. But the other thing that is never explained, I feel like, is Rorschach's mask. What, in the book, do you have any understanding of, like, is it just like a supernatural, like, the mask is empathic to him and changes? Is it like some weird physics thing?
There's nothing explicit in the narrative of the graphic novel, except that Rorschach says that is his face. Clearly it wasn't when because like he's like was ostensibly human at some point, but once he found it's like my personal, because like again it's not explicitly stated anywhere. My personal thing is that his analog is supposed to be like a Spider-Man thing where that's a symbiote. And so it's like his mask is a symbiotic relationship thing with him, and so there is that kind of empathic connection.
Right.
But obviously, because everybody in Watchmen has to be absurdly broken, it's not really clear if he just thinks that's what it is, or if that is what it actually is. And it's also not clear, because no character ever comments on it, whether when we see the mask change forms, because obviously you can't do motion in a graphic novel, you just see that every time you're looking at the mask, it's got a different thing on it. Whether or not that's actually what other people see, or whether that's what Rorschach thinks they see.
And this might be a place where, you know, there's a possibility for ambiguity and a unreliable narrator in a book, like the camera can't be an unreliable narrator.
Exactly.
The camera just shows you what is happening. So that makes sense. But so anyway, putting that aside, and I'm willing to, I finally got it in here. Just blame that on bad movie making by Zack Snyder.
Yes,
we did it. We did it. And I just said it. The joke is because I think this is his best movie. I think this is him like doing things that he's good at, but he does screw some things up. But all right, what's your overall take on Rorschach the character?
Well, so it's a slow burn to get to what his deal is in both the movie and the graphic novel. He's, going around like ostensibly being the hard-nosed noir detective kind of character, right?
Right.
When you learn his origin and what he's about, he's slightly less sad, in my opinion, than Mr. Hooters, but only just. Because at least like his origin story as a hero, like, is one of the ones that you can actually connect with.
Right.
Because he grew up in an abusive environment and saw horrible things. And so, like, the whole, like, up to and including the creation of a persona to help deal with things and having to literally put on a face, quote unquote, to deal with stuff, like, that's very real.
Yeah.
Right? And something that you can connect with. Clearly, he's not, like, there's a problem with his character as well, in that he's quote crazy, unquote, right? And it's that whole mental unwellness or mental illness being portrayed for the sake of sensationalizing it, right? Or putting him in a box that is not something I'm super fond of in almost any narrative.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's interesting you use the word hero. To me, Rorschach is someone straight out of a Batman's villains rogue gallery.
Yes.
Because to me, he's not a hero. He is...
But he thinks he is.
Right. I mean, he's incredibly racist. He's incredibly sexist. He's incredibly moralistic in deeply problematic ways. And he, looks at people in, his whole idea is that he hates moral grayness. And he sees the world in very clear black and white ideas. And he's willing to throw under the bus anyone who does not match his ideas of moral and sexual and ethical purity. And to me, that's all the markings of a complete and utter villain. But a villain who, like you said, you can see the path of how his background led to him being who he is. But it's that, like you said, it's that Batman mental illness. Bad things happened to him, and then he went crazy, and now he is who he is.
Right. It's the "and then he went crazy" part that's just like it never plays for me.
And yet the thing that makes I think his character so interesting is he's also the only one who recognizes the problem. And we'll get to it in a second when we talk about Ozymandias, as much as I disagree with him on so many things, I feel like he's it's true, he is the only one who's willing to stand up and say no to Ozymandias and say, it's not okay to let you get away with this.
Right.
Does that seem fitting for him, or does that seem weird for you with him?
Oh, no, it definitely seems fitting for him, because his character is so if you're viewing this as an actual Cold War story, he's the anti-establishment character.
Right.
Right? So him, like, you could see the narrative being painted as he is against world peace, so he's wrong. But I disagree. In that particular instance, I think he's got the right idea.
Right.
And that the world deserves to know and not have the wool pulled over their eyes and be manipulated into some kind of false peace. Because, I have opinions on Ozymandias' plan.
We'll get to that in a second, as well as my bad pronunciation of his name.
But you can see you could see somebody making a narrative, right, where they say, well, Rorschach is this repugnant, clearly not right person because they are willing to abandon world peace just because of some inconvenient truth.
Yeah. Well, and so I think the last thing I would say about Rorschach is, to me, like, the more I think about it, it's not that I think that he is right as much as it's like a broken clock is right, twice a day. Because I think Rorschach's approach to everything is that there is no morally, ethically grayness. There's no moral grayness. Everything is either very clearly right or very clearly wrong. And it leads him to say that Ozymandias killed people, and it doesn't matter what kind of higher goal he had, killing people is wrong, so Ozymandias is wrong and bad. And I don't agree with that level of moral, certainty and black and whiteness. But I do think he's correct that overall I am against what Ozymandias... It's almost like, which is better, the moral black and whiteness of Rorschach or the moral cowardice of Hooters? And
right, and it's not an either or. Right?
Yeah, like I want there to be
moment to moment.
I want there to be a middle ground, and someone goes through a more complicated ethical decision making to, I think, then come to the same place with Ozymandias. But it's definitely different. But it makes, like, I think I am more comfortable with a movie in which Rorschach is a villain, and I don't want to see many movies like this where Rorschach is not a villain. But the fact that Rorschach is not a villain makes it, I think, such a good movie. In some ways, like, because it is so different, and because it does throw you, and because it does challenge my understandings of what a hero or a villain is supposed to be.
Right. I mean, Rorschach is a protagonist in the story. I don't think you can apply this is a later question in our notes here, but I don't think you can apply the label of hero or villain to any of these people, really. Well, villain for sure,
right.
Many of them, but hero, no, not.
But certainly not hero. No, you're right.
Yes.
I think when faced with a question of, a great moral question at the end of the movie, I think Rorschach chooses right.
Right.
But I think the things that make me dislike him are also the things that make him choose right. But I don't think that makes him a hero. But it also means that I don't. Until that moment, I might find it easier to put him below all the other characters, and now I'm not so sure about that.
Right. You can't have somebody who's a moral absolutist type character, who you don't occasionally agree with outside of some, like, literal bizarro circumstance, like literally the character Bizarro who everything is opposite, right? You're gonna align with somebody's idea of right and wrong sometime, but that doesn't mean that your, like, completely rigid this is right, this is wrong system is inviolate. It just means that one instance we happen to align.
Right. So let's talk about Ozzy.
Yeah.
What's your take on what he does here?
Well, he bit the head off of a bat during a concert, and I'm not really okay with that.
But then he went on to become a cheesy reality star as a dad, so who knows?
Yeah.
Ozymandias, not Osborne.
Ozymandias, so yes. Ozzy, as you say, he's actually the reason I ended up enjoying the Watchmen story as much as I did. Because he's a character that throughout the story, he's held up as this, like, very fine, upstanding person, always, like, out to do the right thing and advance the greatest good and doing, stuff for charity or whatever. And at the end of it, he's got his supervillain monitor set up, right? And watching the world and doing the thing and being like, hey, like, he monologues about his evil plan, right? His quote-unquote evil plan.
Right.
And there's a moment, and I think they kept it in the movie. I hope they did, because it's, like, one of the best, where they have that exchange with him, right? Where they're all like, you've got to be stopped. When is this happening? And he's all like, are you kidding me? It happened like 5 seconds ago, or 5 minutes ago, or whatever. It's like, too late.
Like, that itself was a really nice twist on the idiotic part of that, the comic villain monologue.
The subversion of that particular trope, I appreciated a lot. But then also this idea that because Ozymandias, I think, is a perfect example of our villain with a point thing.
Right.
Right? I don't agree with his point, but it makes his character more interesting because his objective of world peace is laudable, right? Like ending conflict between humans is laudable. In the graphic novel, he does this by convincing human beings that they're not alone in the universe, right? And that for me was the big miss of the movie, was changing that only because they thought that a giant squid landing in Central Park wouldn't play.
So, well, let me ask you there, because again, I haven't seen it, but like I said, I've seen the way that incident is played in the TV show, because in the TV show it is like they reference back what happened in the book, and it's a giant squid and not just Dr. Manhattan bombs. And the perception there is that it's not a like existential, we're not alone in the universe. It's there's an existential threat greater than any that humanity could imagine, and so we have to come together to fight it. And whether it's a giant squid or Dr. Manhattan is immaterial.
Right. It's basically, it's like Independence Day, that great movie with Will Smith, where the intent is, here's a threat, here's something for you to unify against. It doesn't matter what it is, but here's something for you to unify against. I always felt the narrative should be, hey, here's Doc Manhattan. Why aren't we all trying to stop Doc Manhattan?
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's neither here nor there, I guess. But yeah, like, the central thing is supposed to be, here's something to unify around, and then the world just sort of falls in line, I guess. Which, that part of it is the part I really have to suspend my disbelief and really stretch what I believe can really happen.
So let's divide this into two different questions, because I think it's important to separate them. The first question let's make, do we think Ozymandias is right that this would work? And then the second one I think is, if we assume that would work, is it morally justified?
I think that's a great way to frame this discussion.
So let's just start with, and I will say I think it's interesting, and I actually want to look up, when did Ender's Game, the book, come out? Do you know? I think it's later than this. I ask because 1985. So interesting, the same time.
Same year.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it was kind of. So the reason I ask is because for anyone who hasn't read Ender's Game, it's not the point of anything, but it starts with the same general conceit. It's a conceit that Robert Heinlein talked about. I mean, it's not unique in the science fiction, but that once humanity encounters an existential outside threat, humanity will utterly unify. And because they realize like their petty problems are not as important in comparison to the larger threat. And, there is historical evidence for this, that a lot of like times, small pieces of a nation become unified to fight some outside threat, and people try to manipulate that. But one of the points that Ender's Game, the movie, makes that I really like is that the minute people start to think the existential threat is defeated, the whole system will fall apart and everybody will go back to fighting each other again. And I guess where I'm going at that is that on some fundamental level, I don't think Ozzy is right. I don't think that having this kind of existential threat would bring, look at the United States and the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. They worked together, but they still hated each other, and they were constantly sniping at each other and constantly finding ways to see who would have more advantage in the post-war world. And a lot of that set up, led directly to the Cold War, during which the United States and Russia were even more at each other's throat than they'd been before the Nazis emerged. So yeah, I kind of feel like Ozzy's central conceit is wrong. But what's your take there?
So I kind of would go one step further. I think that the conceit... So, I agree with you, but I actually disagree with the idea that it would ever work even initially. I think that there's probably some alliances that would form and some more working, short-term working together would happen.
Right.
But in terms of, actually unifying all of the different world governments and whatnot under one banner, nope. That is a pie in the sky idea, and like just dropping a squid in Central Park ain't gonna do nothing.
Yeah. And I will say again for the TV show, and again, apologies, minor spoilers, but this is all over the trailers. One thing you see in the TV show is that like Ozzy is still like occasionally dropping like squid that are small enough to be harmless, but still in a like, nope, they're still out there kind of a way. As though this one thing wasn't enough.
Yeah, he's like continuing the plan,
right,
to make sure that everyone stays in fear of this ever-present threat.
Yeah. No, I think that's, and I think the one way something like this could work is if it became multi-generational. You know, if you kept it up long enough that you had numerous generations who grew up not knowing that they were supposed to hate other people on their own planet because the hatred of the people outside the planet was supposed to be so strong, then I could kind of buy it. But I feel like if people who had grown up thinking we're supposed to hate the Soviets or supposed to hate the Americans or hate whoever, you know, go back to that within their own lifetimes, I don't see any way it could work.
Yeah. Same. Like, it seems like such a... I get it, and I get that that's what the narrative is supposed to be, so there's a conceit in it, but I think in real life a lot of this wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? So I guess within the realm of the fiction, I can concede that it might work in the short term.
Yeah. So having said that, let's now change the focus and say, let's assume that it works. Let's assume that there is a very real chance of nuclear war, and that doing this thing and sacrificing millions of people completely arbitrarily does prevent the chance of nuclear war for a significant amount of time. Does that make it okay?
Ugh. So, here's the issue. Like, if an extinction level event, right, is a certainty, sure. Now suddenly it's a numbers thing.
Right.
Right? And if you're looking at it from a very macro perspective of how do we save the most lives, right? You could argue that it's a, you know, kind of a big extrapolation of a firefighter decision.
Right.
And therefore, like, making the decision that and taking the action that saves the most lives has to be the one that you pick. Right, has to be what you do, and that if inaction causes the other outcome, then you have to do something.
Right.
It really hinges on that certainty, though.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like. For me, it doesn't feel as though when it happens that the apocalypse is like seriously nigh.
Yeah.
That it is more of he thinks it'll happen eventually, and is trying to get out way ahead of it.
Yeah.
Even though there's a person who can like literally stop it if he wants to.
Yeah, and that's the other weird thing is because like Ozymandias actively removes Dr. Manhattan from being able to, you know, tries to get him to go to Mars and sort of run away from the planet. And
yep.
I think there's something, I think the conceit is supposed to be that Dr. Manhattan has lost his interest in humanity and thus would not stop it the way he might have 20 or 30 years ago. Is that your understanding of how it's going?
Yeah. Yeah, basically the like that has to exist in order to make Ozymandias' motivations make any sense.
Right.
Because otherwise he could just say, "Hey Doc, can you like make sure this doesn't ever happen?"
Right.
Cool. Like disarm literally every nuclear warhead by clicking your fingers because you can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think it's a hard thing because in an ideal world, I feel like the problem here is the unilateral decision making and Ozzy just saying, I know what's right, I know what's good, and I get to decide, and no one else gets to tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah,
and,
it's a very fascist line.
Right. And I feel like, yeah, you're right, it's exactly the definition of fascism. It's I know best. It's very Robert Heinlein in that regard. I mean, so many of Robert Heinlein's heroes are exactly this. And I feel like part of the issue is that Ozzy is presented clearly as having such a huge ego, and that there's no way to get that out of the equation. That there's no way to say, like, when you have an ego that big, of course you feel like, your way is the only way to do things, and humanity needs you. And this goes way back to the conversation we had about the character of Jace in the Magic the Gathering story, but I feel like I am always going to be scared of the character, especially the white male kind of, put upon character who says, I know best, and if people just listen to what I say and think, even if there's a big, sacrifice to be made, the world would be better.
Right. And it, like that again, it makes Ozymandias' character make more sense, right? Because he does have that ego, and so I 100% believe that he is certain that that if he doesn't take this action, humanity will destroy itself.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's why he sees himself as the hero of his own story, which makes him a good villain. But it's terrifying to think of somebody who is so convinced and is so certain that they are correct and the actions they are taking are justified, that they're willing to sacrifice a bunch of lives that might be being lost needlessly.
Yeah.
Right? In the advance of their objective.
And I also think, and again here, I don't know how much of this the author intended, but once you get into a place of seeing yourself as the smartest person in the world and smarter than everyone else, the next logical step is that you think everybody else is stupid. And I feel like part of what that mentality leads to is the idea of no one else could make the right decision and not go to war. It's a kind of like, I need to step in because these people are all idiot children who need me, and it both denies anyone else the ability to, develop their own agency, but it also, like, as we said, in the real world, yes, we came very close to nuclear war a couple of times, but without the help of an Ozymandias, the, normal human people, as stupid as we are, figured out a way to back away from the extinction level event. And I feel like that's part of where Ozzy's hubris goes. It just prevents the idea of that even being a possibility.
Absolutely. And it's because of that, it's because of that hubris, again, that his actions make sense. But it's also because of that hubris that I could just never agree with him.
Yeah.
Because I know what his conceit is, and I'm never going to come down on the side of, well, you think you're right about everything, so you're right about this. That just, for whatever reason, that's not how my brain works. If somebody says, I know with 100% certainty, my immediate reaction is, no, you don't.
So let's now go to the last part of that question, which is, once our characters, I'm not going to say once our heroes, but once our characters have discovered what Ozymandias has done, Manhattan and Hooters say, okay, well, this was terrible, and we're going to wag our finger of shame at you, but you're right that if the world finds out, it would be bad, so we're just going to walk away and let you do this. And Rorschach says, no, F that, I'm going to go tell the world, and Dr. Manhattan eventually, blows him up as a person to stop him from doing that. In a confrontation where Rorschach basically says, like, look, if you're going to do that, you need to just go ahead and do it. And kind of almost pushes Dr. Manhattan to do it. Like, kind of says, like, go ahead, do it. I dare, not I dare you, but, like, yells at him to do it. Suicide by Dr. Manhattan is maybe the best way to look at it. What's your take on how that plays out and the way those three different characters react?
Deeply upsetting.
Yeah.
So Mr. Hooter's reaction is incredibly consistent. Of course, all he does is shrugs his shoulder and goes, well, no one can do anything. Right? Because that's his whole character. He doesn't do anything. He is the most impotent protagonist you will ever see. The Doc Manhattan's reaction is like he doesn't actually care, and we know he doesn't actually care. What is the most troubling to me is that Rorschach is able to goad Doc Manhattan into taking that action. Because Doc Manhattan shouldn't, like, he's reached the point of being like a ostensibly completely emotionless being right at that point. Not connected to anything, doesn't care about anything like this, and yet he couldn't be arsed to stand up and stop the death of somebody who didn't do anything wrong, but can be arsed to assassinate somebody who's trying to take an ethical stance.
Right. Yeah, I hated the way that ended. I hated Dan for not standing by Rorschach, because again, like, Rorschach, as awful as a person he is, I feel like on some level, even if you think that there is some moral worth to what Ozzy is doing, you still have to turn him in. You still have to. If for nothing else, like, how fundamentally does it break society for now, society to go on this mass, fear of this thing that doesn't actually exist? I am a big believer of, like, the truth sets you free, and the idea that not only would Ozzy do this, but then these other characters would say, we're going to conspire with you in this lie.
And for whatever reason, like, I think it's because all of those characters, with the exception of Rorschach, their core precept is based in authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And Rorschach, being again the anti-establishment character, is the only one that speaks up and then gets silenced,
right?
Because you don't question the big dad.
And he gets silenced in a way, like you said, it is so violent compared to.
Yep.
When you think about all the ways that Dr. Manhattan could basically, like, imprison someone or silence them or just sort of keep them from doing this thing, instead he quite violently, like, explodes his body.
Yeah, it feels personal. And that doesn't make sense with Dr. Manhattan's character as it's been presented, right?
Yeah, I think that's very true.
So, either in that moment, Rorschach said something that actually evoked emotional response, which is upsetting in its own right, given that we haven't seen hide nor hair of that from the good doctor in almost the entirety of the media of the story, or his conviction that this is so certainly the right thing that the world needs was strong enough that he felt like he needed to make a statement,
right?
And, like, in case anybody was watching, just very upsetting.
So in the book, does Rorschach shout, like, if you're going to do it, do it? And then
yeah. Same scene. Again, there's actually very few differences between the movie and the graphic novel.
I've heard shot for shot. It's very similar.
Yes, it's there's the bomb versus squid thing that we talked about, and there's, like, the fact that in the graphic novel the story is told twice rather than once.
Right.
So through a sub-graphic novel.
the Black Freighter, yeah. In my impression watching the movie is that Manhattan doesn't want to do this. And the look on his face especially seems resigned and almost a little merciful. And I'm wondering if on some level it's, Rorschach wants to do this, realizes that Manhattan is going to stop him. And then on some level that Rorschach is kind of saying, like, please don't arrest me, please don't hold me back and enchain me. Please, if you're not going to let me do this, just kill me. And that to some extent, in Rorschach's world that is supposed to be so clear and morally black and white, and where, he has a grudging respect for, Owlman and Spectre and the rest of them. And I wonder if part of this is supposed to be that, like, once he realizes that the others won't support him in turning in Ozymandias, so much of Rorschach's world has just fallen into that, no one is going to support me in doing the right thing. Everyone is morally compromised. That he kind of just wants to either be like, look, either I'm going to turn you in or I'm going to die. I don't want to live in a world where I can't turn you in. Did you get any of that?
I guess I'm unwilling to ascribe mercy to the actions that Dr. Manhattan takes.
That's fair.
I do think that is basically what Rorschach is saying at the end, is I think he realizes that there's no possible way that he's going to be permitted to get the truth out there. And he wants to make it very clear that is not... He doesn't want to live if that can't happen.
Right.
Right? But the fact that he does it in such a way as to try to goad Dr. Manhattan into taking the action to end his life is just like the conceit that he could get an emotional reaction out of Dr. Manhattan is interesting. And I think, personally, I think he did get one.
Yeah.
Which makes it more upsetting. Because it's like no other human could do that, and Doc Manhattan probably eliminated him, if you want to really read into the narrative, because he did.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because I think actually we have two distinct other moments where Dr. Manhattan has an emotional reaction. One is that he is clearly upset at the idea that he is upsetting Silk Spectre, his girlfriend. But the other is when he seems to think that he's causing people cancer. I mean, he very clearly gets very frustrated, but also just actually upset, and he basically fucks off to Mars, quite literally. So I see what you're saying, but I do think that he is very capable of emotional reaction. He just thinks he should not be.
Right. He doesn't see the value, and it's the honestly pretty toxic masculine concept,
right,
that if you're very, very smart, you can be like a Vulcan and contain your emotions because they don't serve you.
Yeah, I think the Vulcan comparison is very apt.
Yeah. But I think you are correct, and I had forgotten about the him thinking at one point that he's giving people cancer. I think that was actually part of Ozymandias' attempt to trick him away from the planet,
just to get him to run away to Mars.
Yeah. I'd forgotten all about that, so thank you for bringing that up. You're right. He does show signs of caring, and so, but that I think lends even more to the idea that in that moment, Rorschach does get to Doc Manhattan, and that's why he ultimately makes the decision.
Yeah. So let's move on to our last question, which is, and I think we've kind of answered it pretty thoroughly already, but we can kind of review: is anyone remotely heroic in this movie or this story?
Nope. Done.
Yeah.
I mean, you could make a argument for Silk Spectre if she had more agency and more I guess lines. I don't know. Just she's not as much of a part of the narrative as I feel like a character should be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. Is I think you become a hero through acting on your moral agency, and she just never does that. It's what's most frustrating with her character. Like, I think there is nothing she does that is not morally good. It's not that she does anything where you're like, ooh, that was terrible of her.
Unlike every other character where we see, like, Mr. Hooters doing, through inaction, allowing evil to happen. Right? And they're, like, I don't remember us seeing anything like that with Silk Spectre.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But yeah, beyond her, like, Rorschach is morally interesting in some ways, but pretty much an asshole. Comedian is terrible. Hooters is just morally, a coward. I kind of wish we'd learned more about Mordok, the person with the weird ears who fights the comedian, but there's nothing there. Ozymandias thinks he's a hero, but I think is deeply misguided, and not even like Magneto and Killmonger, people like that. I can very seriously be like, you know what, you're very close to being right. To me, Ozzy is more like Mr. Freeze or someone like that, where it's like, okay, from your very screwed up perspective, I see your point, but your point is not really, your perspective is not one that makes any sense to me.
Right. Most of the characters in the movie are presented as though they believe themselves to be heroes.
Right.
But I don't think any of them qualify.
Yeah.
Because the one that gets the closest, in my opinion, is actually Rorschach. But he's such a reprehensible human being,
right,
that I can't get behind calling him a hero either. And you certainly can't call the comedian a hero. You can't call somebody who, again, through inaction allows evil to pass a hero. As you mentioned very rightly earlier, there are multiple moments. The one that you talk about with the protest is the big one, where he could do something and doesn't,
Yeah.
because that would make his life harder, basically. And he's just unwilling to overcome that inertia, but apparently really wants to think of himself as a hero anyway.
Yeah. And I think that's, especially with Rorschach, to go back, I wonder also how much of this is our changed understanding, because not that I ever think this was a good thing, but in the 80s, it was often the thing of like, introduce someone as a villain, but then give them a sympathetic story, and now they're not a villain anymore because you understand them. And now at least I think with someone like Rorschach, we can say like, the horrible upbringing he has explains why he is the way he is, but it doesn't excuse it. And I think that distinction was one that people were not making at the time this was made.
I'm not sure either way on that one. Not aware enough at the time this was made to know if that was a common thing in fiction.
That's certainly fair.
I mean, I know around this time period is when we get shows like Forever Knight, so I could look at that.
That's certainly true.
Man, such a good show.
That is one I have not seen, but who knows? Maybe it'll come up.
Oh, you'd love it. It's about a vampire who's a cop.
Awesome.
It's great. I really legitimately recommend this Bad 80s show.
Okay. I mean, you kind of had me at Bad 80s show, so we'll just have to see.
Yeah, Bad 80s show where a vampire is a cop. Are you kidding me? I'm surprised you haven't seen it.
All right. With that note of cultural wisdom, I think it is time to wrap up. So any last thoughts?
So one thing, excuse me, I'm going to die on mic for a bit here. One thing I wanted to make sure I said, because it's a scene that happens both in the graphic novel and in the movie that is very challenging. There's a point where Miss Jupiter, or Silk Spectre's mom, I think her character's name is Miss Jupiter, is talking about the attempted rape by the comedian when being confronted about it. And basically, like, I don't want to say waves it off, but it's a... You know the scene I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's in the movie.
When her mother...
It's all like, well, it was a different time or whatever. She, like, makes some excuses, and, like... I don't feel particularly qualified to comment about how realistic that is.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that it is the most egregious example of the... how women characters are treated in the story in general. It's the thing that makes me not want to like Watchmen as a story. There's a lot of the, like, I end up still liking Watchmen, and I feel like maybe that's something wrong with me. But like that particular scene and the stuff around it is really what makes me feel like there's a problem with this story.
I guess I came away from it with a different impression, and maybe I am giving them too much credit, because the impression that I had was, like, I think the way you can see it is that clearly the mother is acting as a product of rape culture. And the question then is, do the authors know that?
Exactly.
Is it that the writers think that, of course, it wasn't a big deal, and maybe they found each other later, in which case it's horribly screwed up? Or, and this is actually what I was more seeing, and I'm not sure if I'm projecting my own understanding backwards onto the movie itself and onto the story, but my take on it was that the writers are showing this as, like, yes, this is a thing that happens, and I most assuredly know that it is.
Right.
But that's not a good thing, and that's actually more a sign of, like, I feel like the author is walking this thin line, and probably that the movie, continues that, of acknowledging that there were shitty, terrible things that would have been happening to women superheroes of this time. And I feel like there's some commentary on that. Silk Spectre talks about, like, how ridiculous it is that her uniform has to be so sexualized. There's basically, like, latex thigh highs for no reason whatsoever and things like that. But at the same time, it's like we want to point out that this culture is bad and wrong, and that you are wrong for enjoying it. But we're also going to titillate you and make you enjoy it again in order to get you to come see our movie.
Yeah, it's just, yeah. I can't get behind the latter part of it.
Yeah.
If it's intended as social commentary, there are ways to do that, and I'm looking forward to eventually seeing Birds of Prey, because there are ways of doing that aren't exploitative, or that don't sensationalize it or tantalize you with stuff that is morally repulsive.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like on some level, and not that I'm going to make you watch the first movie, but if you ever wanted to teach a class on what the male versus the female gaze means, just watch the scenes with Harley Quinn from Suicide Squad and then Birds of Prey, because the difference is literally night and day. It is so stark.
So anyway, I wanted to make sure that, because we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, and I feel bad about that, particularly because it is important. It is an important part of the story. It is given multiple story beats, and ultimately comes down on something else that's deeply upsetting, which does fit the rest of the.
Yeah.
So like, I guess it fits in, but not in ways that are comfortable.
Yeah. No, I think that's very well put. And I think, as always, dear listeners, we've been wrestling with some pretty heady questions. As you can tell, I think we're pretty it's a kind of like, it's a good uncomfort. Like I think I've mentioned before, one of my favorite quotes is that, like, things should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And this feels like a time where that's what's happening, is that we're sort of being pressed to step outside our normal ethical worlds and question things in new ways. This is what I love, and I want to hear from more of you. What do you guys think? Are there people out there who think, actually some of these Watchmen are total heroes, or who think, Ozzy was right, or anything, or you agree with us, you disagree with us? Let us know. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Gmail, all at Superhero Ethics. On Facebook, we have both a page and a group. You have to join the group, but you'll be automatically added unless if your profile picture is a swastika, then no. But anyone else, you're probably coming in. Confederate flag probably also out, but you get my point. But find us in any of those. Continue the conversation. Let us know what you think. As mentioned briefly, this podcast is part of the Stranded Panda Podcast Network, in which, if you enjoy the kind of deep dive into a particular property, you can find that with so many genre things. We currently have podcasts about the MCU verse, the DC on-screen verse, one entirely on the Watchmen TV show, and then ones that I'm personally involved with on the Star Wars universe and the Orville universe. So check some of those out. Please, if you like what we do, we'd love to have your support on Patreon. It's a great way to help us, keep the lights on and keep doing what we're doing. We'd love for you to write a 5-star review, tell other people what we're doing, help get the word out. On behalf of myself, on behalf of Jacob, thank you guys all for being great listeners. Have a good day.